treaty. And interestingly enough, you advised the development bank on the development of green technology. So the question is, how do you, in a country that is still overly dependent on coal, how do you accelerate the reshuffling of the energy grid, and what would be needed, of course, from a legal perspective, but also perhaps from a financial perspective?
Thank you very much. And sorry, we had a very long night yesterday indeed.
Not just you, but there are others. Myself. I won't give a name.
Certainly. And also thank you to BSF for giving us voice to the younger generation. I think it's very important for us to speak about these things, as, you know, at some point it will be passing on the baton to the next generation. And so in terms of the ECT, I think there's one major point to be made here. And it relates to what Anna was saying before. It's an important story, I think, to bear in mind, because the ECT is a sort of a template story for how things should not work in negotiating, let's say, the overall institutional/legal architecture for us to move forward in the green transition. Indeed, the treaty was conceived initially to protect the interest of Western corporates as they were going into these former Soviet markets. Now, fast forward 30 years, the arbitration clause that is contained therein is mostly invoked for renewables disputes, meaning that investors who invest in renewables, they oftentimes sue countries in order to receive compensations in renewables-related disputes. And the thing is that the EU realized at some point that, well, hey, perhaps we should possibly align the treaty now with the requirements of the Paris Agreement. And so hence the modernization process started. Where did it lead and where did it end? Well, it took over 2 years for us just to realize that there is no way whatsoever to align the interest of Europe, as we see the treaty, and the Japanese. And the result of that is that the EU decided, and we, Poland, had a big say in that actually initially. We decided to leave the treaty altogether, while the Japanese, to be honest, want to keep it as it is. And why is that? It's because they have a different perception of how the whole green energy transition should go about. They have the companies around the world that have billions invested in different renewables projects they want to protect, while at the same time pursuing the green energy transition. So there's a big lesson in that. And regarding your second question, let me tell you a brief story, and I think it kind of taps into a bunch of things that were being said before. I had the privilege of leading the expert mission of the Polish Development Bank to COP28, and we were there for 2 weeks speaking to different stakeholders of different countries about what it is that Polish companies, as they decarbonize also, and have these different wonderful, sometimes sustainable, deployable solutions that could actually alleviate a lot of climate-related crises here and there in the world, how they can be advocated for elsewhere in the world. And one day, there is this delegation from Zimbabwe that comes to us. And after having that inspiring conversation that lasted maybe half an hour, we realized that they are not interested in windmills, they're not interested in PVs, they're not interested in a lot of technologies that matter to us in Europe or in the West. They're interested, for instance, in that very specific case, in waste to hydrogen technology, which is because they have a lot of waste that they would like to turn into hydrogen. Now, from our standpoint, that was a bit bizarre because it was the last technology we thought that they would be interested in. But then we did not know much about what it is that the needs over there are. And the point here is, and I think it taps into what your minister said, is that we should pay more heed to what the global south is looking for. Because it's not like we are going to take decisions for them. They are taking their own decisions. And one major point that I would like to make in here also is that in terms of, and actually speaking now a little bit more from my academic hat, a lot is being said now about, you know, critical minerals and how we should go about this. Well, perhaps the most consequential effect of the green energy transition, which is just yet another energy transition. We had a lot before. Maybe this is the only one, the last one I meant. But nonetheless, perhaps the most consequential effect of it is the redistribution of power in the international realm. That was the case, we went from charcoal to coal. That was the case when we went from coal to oil. And now, we need these critical minerals for that energy transition to materialize. But then, it's a zero-sum game. Someone has to lose, someone has to win, like in a football match or marriage. And for that matter, what we must perhaps consider is that while eventually all peak will happen and will reach a point where we no longer need fossil fuels, the countries that have those critical minerals we need, unless they assert their sovereignty effectively, they will become objects and not subjects of international law. And we do not want to see these neo-colonial structures to emerge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take, I guess there will be a microphone, and because I'd like to take the questions from the audience, but I'd like to do a small exercise. So I'd like to ask the panelists, imagine I'm Ursula von der Leyen, we almost look alike, and I come to you all and I say, in 2 minutes maximum, can you please advise me on how I can, increase Europe's strategic autonomy, especially on as crucial a topic as energy, while remaining an open partner when it comes to trade, when it comes to development, and I'd say in 2 minutes, and I'd start with you, Gauri.
No, I think it's important to understand that the whole dynamics of trade are getting altered and will get altered. Also, the interdependencies that we see now are going to get altered, and that will then have a very different impact on the geopolitical landscape as we know now, which means that it has to for energy security, especially in the world that's going to become much more electrified. What it means is that interdependence of a very different nature will come into being, which is all about maybe cross-border trade in electricity happening. And that then means that the whole thinking around how these partnerships could happen will change, because it's not about just trading in commodities and having a relationship which is purely fiscal or financial in terms, but much more interdependent in terms of how the regionalization is going to happen. So it means much more collaboration and relationships built on trust with neighbors and with partners in the region, whether Europe or just neighbors in Africa or other parts of the countries.
Thank you, Erik.
A couple of suggestions. Number one, we need to improve our own systems, because unless we are competitive, you can have every sort of idea. If European, say, solar panels are not competitive, well, you can have any idea about strategic independence. There will be none. You need to be competitive, you need good system, and that's where the government regulations are so essential. And a way also to increase the competitiveness is to invite the Chinese companies to invest in Europe. That's what the Chinese did. They invited Tesla to invest in China because they wanted more competition in the Chinese market for electric cars, and they saw Tesla as what they called a top fish, a top predator, which will force all the others to compete. And now, of course, BYD may be well ahead of Tesla when it comes to electric cars. So invite the Chinese companies to invest in Europe to create more competition, and the more partnership they can be, the better. But unless we are competitive, every idea about this is just air. And the second idea is we need to understand that every developing country is there for themselves, not for us. Any Indian, very often Europe and America speaks as if India is there for us. India is a bulwark against China. India is this or that. We should utilize India. No, Prime Minister Modi has one idea. It's for India. It's an all-out Indian foreign policy. It's India first, India second, India third. Then we can partner. And that applies also to the much weaker states in Africa. When Kamala Harris, as the vice president, went around Africa last year, the total framing of that visit in all American media was, this is a countermeasure to China. This is to stop China being dominant in Africa. What is this? The second most important leader of America is touring Africa to contain China, not to force partnership between the United States and Africa. When Xi Jinping or Li Qiang, the Chinese leaders, tour Africa, Chinese are never framing this as a countermeasure to the United States. They're framing it as a partnership between China and Africa to mutual benefit. these days, exactly when we're sitting here, you have the Africa-China meeting in Beijing. It's called FOCAC. Basically, all top leaders of Africa will be there, and they're looking for partnerships with China. There is not one African government, not one, who want to choose between China and the West. Everyone wants partnership with both China and the West, because that's what's benefiting their nations. And we need to understand that we need to work with African nations and all nations in the global south for mutual benefit. And sometimes, sorry to say, that will also demand that we are a little bit less finger-pointing to issues in our partner countries which we don't like. We don't expect African countries to come to Europe to finger-point to what they don't like in Europe. And we should be a little bit more reluctant to do that when we see something we don't like in Africa. Let's partner. And let's showcase our own values in a dialogue. That's a more effective way.
Thank you. It echoes what a foreign minister of a big Asian country told me some months ago. Do we have the right not to choose between Washington and Beijing? And Europe should understand that. Anna, to you. In 2 minutes.
I won't repeat what Erik just said. I think interdependence is the key word I would give to Ursula. But I'll then open another topic which we haven't touched, but I think you asked me what would be the solution that I would give to Ursula. And I would say nuclear energy has to be part of the solution. And it's been clearly identified even in COP28 as a crucial solution. There's a commitment to triple nuclear energy by 2050. And I mean, I won't now elaborate about all the reasons for it, but I think at the very least it should be, there's just been a study that was done in Germany about how much CO2 emissions would have been reduced since 2002 and 2022, so in the 20-year period, had they not decommissioned nuclear, and how much less it would have cost to do that. So there's a huge amount of debate that needs to be had. Including on energy transition and how it delivers. And I think a very worrying thing that has happened, that has been identified by the German Federal Audit Office, is that Germany, and as a leading, I guess, proponent of Energiewende and just generally of renewables, has just abandoned the monitoring of impact of renewables on the environment as a mechanism. So the Federal Audit Office has said, if you want to win specifically the hearts and minds of ordinary people, you will need to monitor how much impact on the environment renewables has. Because if you can't even monitor it, then any skepticism will be confirmed. And so that's been those are the kind of things that the EU needs to work on, I think, much more than it has now.
Thank you very much. Christian?
Yeah, if I was advising the President of the European Commission, I would point to two things. One more internal to us and one more externally relevant. The internal one is, I think the President should push at leaders level, not energy ministers level necessarily, at leaders level, the discussion whether we are willing, in order to get greater energy independence, to opt for more energy interdependence, which sounds politically super attractive and elusive, but the implications are profound. It means we need to coordinate and plan more, we need to cost share more as we share benefits more, we need to have system operation much more regionally optimized as opposed to very nationally anchored. We need different oversight mechanisms, et cetera, et cetera. It's a fundamental political discussion, so it's not morally or intellectually superior than the other, but boy, would the benefits be significant, but there's a price to be paid. Then there's the external one. This comes back to diversification as opposed to self-sufficiency. That's what I would advise. Go for smart and targeted in terms of what you do industrial policy, where the entry barrier is high, where's the value add proposition very high, what is critical as opposed to non-critical, because if you do that balanced, I think you can make a deal with the developing world, which is good for them and good for us. So you sort of diffuse the, I think, suspicion in certain quarters that this is protectionism disguised as security and et cetera. And that in turn will then, lower the finger pointing that you were pointing to. Let me just give a final word on that, on finger pointing. One example. So some time ago, when I was in the Danish government, but also in other contexts, we worked quite a bit, as I think you have, Erik, on fossil fuel subsidy reform. And very often, the line is fossil fuel subsidy reform. Fossil fuel subsidies vastly outweigh renewable subsidies. This is the stupidest thing on the planet. You're subsidizing the past and not the future. No brainer, right? You know, go to the developing world, no brainer. Now here comes the fun fact for you guys. Which jurisdiction on this planet had the highest number of fossil fuel subsidies, according to OECD methodology, from 2022 to 2023? Whom do you think that was? Guess.
Norway.
Well, okay. Europe. Why? Because we faced an enormous energy price spike, and there was legitimate political concerns about the effects on households and businesses, and a need to alleviate that via the public purse. Okay, crisis, yeah. So what is fossil fuel subsidies in many developing jurisdictions? It's a substitute for an institutional system which in a more efficient way can do cash transfer. So they use it exactly for the same thing. I'm not saying they're not wasteful subsidies, no. So we need to stop the finger pointing and, you know, we all have our issues. Let's deal with them, and hopefully in a collaborative spirit where we don't overstretch in terms of how self-sufficient we want to be.
Thank you very much, Christian. Sabrina, 2 minutes.
Thank you. I'd love to pick up on some points that have been made on the panel, but first of all, I would tell Ursula von der Leyen, don't stray from the past. You know, let's remain committed to carbon neutrality, climate neutrality. This is also the economic opportunity for the future. And this is the most important signal investors need in order to keep interested in this. So that's my main message. Diversification at all costs. Yes, absolutely. This is not about strategic autonomy as such. It's about diversifying suppliers, diversifying supply routes, including when it comes to renewables. Let's think green hydrogen, including when it comes to critical raw materials. So diversification is my second point. Third point is partnership, Erik. I wholeheartedly agree with you. And I also wonder, is there something that Europe can do better than China or Russia? Can we offer a better deal to partners, especially in Africa? Are we the ones who have now learned to listen in a better way? That's a very serious question I think we need to ask ourselves in Europe. Critical Raw Materials Act, I would probably go into some details to tell you how it could be done better, more efficiently, and how it has to be implemented in a very diligent manner by all member states. But then, and I'm afraid I would also tell Ursula von der Leyen that don't go down that rabbit hole, which is nuclear energy. If we accumulate...
Now the fight begins. Good.
Take it outside.
I think it's important we're having this discussion, because if you calculate the accumulated subsidies that European countries, including Germany, have poured into nuclear over time, it's massively expensive, and it's only very, very few players, very few companies that actually benefit from that. So it's not really a cheap thing, especially at a time of extremely strained public budgets. We have to think about the most affordable option in order for people and industry to consume energy. And in addition, nuclear is the worst possible partner for renewables. Renewables are intermittent, and in order to have backup facility, backup coverage, you need energy that can also be switched on and off at a whim, and that's not the case with a nuclear power station. A nuclear power station might provide base load, but if we are really clever about our new energy system in Europe, including grids, storage system, we will have that base load. It will be much cheaper, and we will have the flexibility in the system that we need in the end.
I'm sure. I mean, Anna is a great and sharp debater on that point. But I'd like to hear Maciej, and then we'll open up to the audience.
Sure, thank you. I'll try to make it quick, although it's very tempting to respond to your nuclear part. Anyways, maybe upon quick reflection, 3 major points I would like to mention. First, innovate. money has to be spent to achieve these technological breakthroughs that are still needed for the transition to really succeed, for instance, in terms of energy storage. And then we should actually, I think, it's a shame for Europe to witness this preposterous statistic that, for instance, that concerns the investments in hydrogen. You know, a year before the Inflation Reduction Act was adopted in the US, investments in the hydrogen sector alone in Europe were 4 times the amount that was spent in the US. Fast forward 2 years, a year after the adoption, it's 50 times bigger in the US than it is in Europe. So we have to do something about this. Second, one thing that I'm not sure if it was really mentioned before, but I believe that there is too much emphasis on mitigation as opposed to adaptation in terms of how the EU tries to project its influence abroad in terms of advancing decarbonization and the climate action. I would dare to say that in countries where the climate crisis has already become so bad that some parts of entire regions have become inhabitable, governments, and rightly so, are very much less concerned about decarbonization than they are about adapting to the changing climate. So that's the second point. And then the third point would be play the long game. The Chinese, for instance, they are looking ahead like 50, 60, 70 years ahead. We are thinking about 2030 or 2050 for that matter. And yeah, for instance, just one example to substantiate this point. There was this excellent report by the RAND Corporation about how the Chinese are thinking about these high voltage, super efficient, smart grids that they are about to deploy, which eventually, if they produce just enough renewables, which they will at some point, may indeed confer them certain sort of leverage upon other countries in the region, which will be an enhancer of their geopolitical might. So we should think about like much more ahead, not only about what it is that we are looking forward to achieve in the next 10 or 15 years, which I'm afraid a lot of policymakers in Europe are mostly concerned about because that's the electoral cycles they're bound by.
Thank you so much. I think we have the best policy advisors we could dream of, and as a president of the Commission, I will, but I think I'll run for the next 10 years. I mean, 5 is clearly not enough. Do we have a microphone? Because I see some hands up, so I guess we have a, yes. Lady will, and if you'd be so kind as to briefly introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, Irnejo Kirche. I'm the head of European Commission representation here in Slovenia. So I am actually the ears and the voice of Ursula von der Leyen. So first of all, thanks a lot. I have listened. I have noted a lot of things, but I have to react on one point, and I have one question to ask. So first on nuclear, just to tell you a fact. Last week, the president was in Prague. And if I cite one part of her speech, she says, we have learned our lesson. When we speak about our energy, we have to produce more of our own energy, more renewables, more nuclear, more efficiency. I'm not going to comment on it right now, but I'm just telling you, read the speech. So let's see what the new mandate of the European Commission starting November, December will look like. So there will be probably a lot of debate on nuclear. That's the statement. And then a question for Minister Solheim. You spoke about China. You said that we have to, that Chinese companies have to invest more in Europe. But we do know that China has a problem with domestic demand. And they're not subsidizing domestic demand, they're subsidizing production. So what will happen if, we have to be more competitive here in Europe, but what will happen if they subsidize their own production and they really flood the entire Europe with extremely cheap product that Europe cannot be competitive against? So do you have an advice to Ursula von der Leyen on that one? Thanks a lot.
That's stage 2 of the job interview, so you passed this.
I think basically that the idea of Chinese subsidies is European propaganda. Look, this is what I have been demanding for the last 20 years. And basically, I think everyone on this panel, we should stop subsidizing fossil fuels and we should start subsidizing the green development. That has been what every green politician in Europe has said for 20 years. So if the Chinese is actually subsidizing, well, that's what we all wanted. There's nothing wrong. But the main issue is the following. Look, the population of China is nearly 3 times Europe, 2.5 times Europe. It's one market. You produce something in, say, Guangdong, that's southern China. You sell it in Heilongjiang, that's northern China. Well, that's much further than from my nation, Norway, to far into Africa. It's one big, demanding market, now highly competitive, also high-tech, when you produce something for that market, the price tends to be very low. So when you have covered all your costs by producing in China, of course what you can sell to the rest of the world will be very, very cheap. That's nothing to do with subsidies. It's just a reflection of the market. I must add, I had a conversation with some European think tank this morning. The Chinese market is also probably working better. There are less hindrances in their market than there is in the European market. But when you have covered your costs selling to a huge domestic market of 60 on everything, well, you can sell electric cars, solar panels, windmills at a very low cost in the global market. That's nothing to do with subsidies. It's just a reflection of a well-functioning market. So what should Europe do? Of course, we need jobs in Europe. Of course, we want to be part of the technology development. The best way of doing that is to invite Chinese companies to produce in Europe. It's completely legitimate to make systems which make it more difficult for China to export from China to Europe, but to produce in Europe. Then we will benefit from the technology development, because, I mean, actually, and the Chinese say electric car companies are far ahead of Europe. Electric batteries is very, very far ahead of Europe. CATL, the biggest electric battery company in the world, there's no one in Europe which can compete at this stage. Then how to gradually build up so Europe can compete, invite them to invest here, share that, of course, force them to share the technology and produce the jobs in Europe. And of course, the same advice I would give to Prime Minister Modi, to every African leader, or whoever who may ask.
Thank you, Erik. Anna?
Yeah, I would concur on that. So the Chinese competitiveness in particular in the EV industry is based on supply chain. It's not based on subsidy. And in any event, we heavily subsidize everything at this point in the EU, and the whole idea of the Critical Minerals Act is based on subsidy. So we should practice what we preach, and that is, I think, and we go back, it's actually cooperation and it's finding your competitive niches. So I don't think we should be trying in Europe to emulate the achievements of China by having our own supply chain from mine to the final product, because we're not that kind of a market, nor are we that kind of a society. We are a society of 27 nations, and we have, our economies are based on small and medium companies, and that is our competitive advantage. So our advantage is in the ability to deliver value added and other markets. So that's what we need to work on. So rather than, there's this whole obsession of bringing back lithium or building lithium-ion batteries in the European Union. The situation in the world at the moment is that there is an overcapacity in that. So why would we want to bring that here when we're already not competitive in that, and subsidize that industry in order to produce something that the world is already producing enough of? We need to find something else to produce and find something else that we are competitive in. The way in which the Chinese got to be dominant in the EV market was because they were not dominant in the original engine market. And so they found the EV as a play. So they found another market, and then they mastered that market. We need to find other products, not try to copy what they do. We are not the US, and we are not China, and so we don't rely on economies of scale of that way. And we have to have strategic partnerships with the world in order to be able to excel in what we are good at. And we need to identify what we are good at, as Christian was saying.
Thank you, Anna. Christian.
Yeah, I think this can take us a long way. This one, I wanted to weigh in as well. I think you point to something crucial, which for me represents this spectrum, sometimes deliberately disguised, between level playing field and protectionism. So level playing field, we have, as you will be very well aware, working for the Commission, we have different facilities available in terms of anti-dumping, etc., and they are thankfully subject to the rule of law and can be challenged, etc., even though it's a bit arduous, and there are processes in place. I think that is bona fide okay, as it were. But of course, one needs to look very carefully when that veers into protectionism disguised as something else. And I'll give you an example. So I'm a Dane. We happen to have strong wind industry in Denmark, although sometimes we overdo it vis-a-vis the Chinese, but never mind. And now there's a bit of bickering about certain projects now across Europe, using Chinese turbines. Chinese turbines, my God, can you believe it? Some of those turbines are produced in Europe with European labor. And the input commodities are sourced from across the world, sometimes Europe, sometimes whatever, as indeed it would be if those wind turbines were being produced in Brazil or in Mexico or in India and whatnot. Is that level playing field? For me, it sounds a little bit more like it's streaking to the other end. So, of course, there's some lobbying calls to keep them out. Of course, if I was a producer, I'd like a monopoly type situation because that's good for my bottom line. But for society, it's awful. And this three-legged stool, boy, is it going to challenge the affordability and, by extension, the overall viability, acceptability of an aggressive transition pathway. So we need to be careful here. So I agree with that produce in Europe that Erik was talking about. And then again, coming back to so what should Europe do, etc. I actually think, per what you said, Anna, I think we can have economies of scale more than we have today in Europe. This is this internal market 2.0, which is being discussed in the bubble, letter report, Draghi report, whatever. And part of that is actually energy. In terms of competitive advantage, fun fact, we have by far the most integrated energy markets on the planet, significantly more than in China and way more in the US, which is much more disparate. We can leverage it, but it comes with a political price. Namely, that we pool our sovereignty more and become more interdependent, and we can work with it, which may not be doable. We also have other competitive advantage points. I would argue, a bit like you were saying, Gauri, the future electricity system will not only be, electric, of course, electric-centric. It'll be highly digitalized, and a well-working one will be one which manages in real time to integrate millions of distributed assets. Lo and behold, some of the leading companies in that are gaining market share in the US and they're European. Hello? So why don't we invest in that? We're doing something valuable and affordability enhancing for the energy system, and we are promoting certain industries where we actually have competitive advantage. So that comes to what you're saying, Anna. Let's point some stuff where we can actually play and do it well, and and we can expand globally, lo and behold.
Sure. We have 3 minutes, so.
No, I just wanted to bring energy efficiency into the conversation. I don't think enough gets talked about, and it's clearly an area that unless you have energy efficient products, business models being taken out, renewables is really not going to be the answer. It has to come. Renewables and energy efficiency are really two sides of the same coin, and I think that's an area where Europe does have an advantage, and I think that's how it goes about building its competitive edge and being able to export these products and these services to the world, which we definitely need, is I think, quite critical.
Thank you, Sabrina.
One very last point. I just want to pick up this point on integrating the European grid much more. And I mean, the idea has been around for decades, let's build a European supergrid so we can really take advantage of the extremely high wind speeds in the west of Ireland and, have cheap electricity in Poland, which is fantastic. And I think what we've learned from the discussion on this panel today is that without Europe pooling sovereignty, without going for more integration rather than less, we will not be able to compete in this global market. We will not be able to survive given the really difficult geopolitics around energy and very many other issues.
Thank you. I know we're out of time, but I have a request from a champion of the earth to give some more minutes. So I'll just hand over to Erik as a closing comment.
I think this has been a wonderful debate, and we got great questions also. I'll just make one point at the end. One problem in Europe is the pessimism. We are speaking always as pessimists. Yesterday we heard from the panel that Europe is now in an unprecedented crisis. Look, is it the same as the Second World War, or Germany dominated by Hitler, or the First World War? Is it unprecedented crisis? No, it's a difficult time. For sure, we have a lot of challenges. But Europe has shown in the past that we could face challenges and overcome. Let's get to that perspective. If you go to India, there's only optimism. I'm not claiming that every single farmer in the poorer part of India is an optimist, but the broad middle class think, oh, the time of India has come. For the first time, India will shine on the global scene. We have every reason to be optimistic. People are getting out of poverty every day, and we have 7% economic growth, which will double the economy every 10 years. That's the Indian perspective. The Chinese perspective is maybe not that optimistic, but also largely optimistic. If we should transform the debate in Europe to the can-do debate, what we can do, we succeeded in the past, maybe we can succeed in the future. So this is a great continent with 600 million brilliant people. Let's get it done, and let's leave the pessimism a little bit behind.
Thank you so much, Erik, for that can-do conclusion. And I think I can ask the representative of the president that Erik did pass the job interview. So, and on that note, thank you very much to the audience, and I wish you a most pleasant day. It will be full of very inspiring discussions. I think the next one will be in 15 minutes. So have a great day.